Hello everybody and welcome to Limited Level Ups. I'm Alex, and this week's episode is our March of the Machine gameplay level up episode. I put these episodes out once per set, usually about a month or so after the set's been out. After the point where most people drafting have an understanding about what the set's about, they know the good cards, they can draft a reasonable deck. And at that point of the format, the biggest edge you can generally gain against the rest of the field is playing your games well, not just drafting well, because everybody's going to have pretty good decks. But I think good gameplay is such an important factor in success in this format that I've decided to do it quite a bit earlier this time. I've done a lot of coaching sessions this week where, the person I meet, they're having trouble in the format, they're drafting fine decks, but when we look at their gameplay logs, there's a ton of both macro and I'd say micro decisions that lead to a good deck performing maybe worse than you might expect. Another thing that kind of pushed me to recording this episode now and just, really highlighting the fact that I think gameplay is so important in this set is I was looking at the 17 lands leaderboards, where you can see who has the most trophies, who has the highest win rate. And what stuck out to me is the good players, the players that I usually see on that list for set to set, they're winning at even a higher rate than they usually would. So, certainly that could be they're really drafting extremely well. But like I said, I think a lot of players that I've seen their decks and they're like, yeah, your deck looks pretty good. That would suggest to me that gameplay is extremely important in this format. And that's what I felt personally playing. And that the good players with all their experience are leveraging that and winning even more than they normally would. And for what it's worth, this is a really, really tough set as far as gameplay is concerned. The cards have a lot of words on them. The game states get really complex. Planning turns ahead is really tough. There are a lot of instances you have to consider that your opponent might have. It's not just as straightforward as something like Phyrexia All-Be-One. If this is your first time joining us for a gameplay episode, the way I like to approach these is I look at some commonly played cards in the format, and I talk about how to best use them, how to best play with them, play against them, and I use some of them as jumping off points to talk about bigger picture concepts, some macro things to think about when you're thinking about gameplay. All that being said, and even though this is mostly a gameplay focused episode, we are still really early in the format, so I do want to talk about some big picture format thoughts that maybe I didn't get around to talking about in last week's episode, the State of the Format address, or some ideas that have maybe become a little more clear to me as I've played more. And I think some of those ideas are gameplay related for sure, and I think they'll really help kind of frame the conversations about some of the specific cards I touch on. And just before we jump in, I do want to shout out the Patreon, patreon.com/limitedlevelups. If you like what we're doing here, if you like the show and you want to support, go check it out. There's a bunch of different reward tiers over there that we want to give back to you if you choose to give back to us. Also want to shout out the Limited Level Ups Discord. There's just like a ton of awesome, very, very good players over there. Pro Tour level players. You got the arena grinders over there. All people that are very, very helpful as well if you want to post your deck or your draft log. A bunch of people that'll be very happy to go analyze that. So check that out if you want to join that. The link is in the description of both the podcast and the YouTube video for this podcast. So yeah, if you're looking to level up your game, go check out that Patreon and check out that Discord too. All right, so we're going to start here with those big picture ideas that I talked about that I think help frame the format and help frame the gameplay. And I've got three main ones that I've been thinking a lot about this week and talking to people on stream about when they're asking, why did you do this in this game? And they all come back to these three main things. And the first one that I want to mention here is, keep this in mind, your stuff is gonna die in this format quite a bit. So I would say in most limited formats, you can kind of expect your opponents to have, 4 good removal spells in their deck. And on average, maybe they'll have 1 in their opening hand, right? There's a lot of really good removal in this set. Dave Humphries, who's the lead designer for this set, actually said he wanted to push the removal, have a little bit more of it, have it be a little more efficient than you normally would, because he knew there was going to be a lot of really powerful rares. You have the Multiverse Legend sheet, a lot of good cards there too. Basically, there's a lot of powerful cards at higher rarities. They wanted to make sure that you didn't just feel high and dry when your opponent casts one. And that leads to, of course, a ton of good interaction spells, especially in blue and black, which are the best colors in the format. So when the removal spells are prevalent, and they're good too, not only can people pick them up, but at the end of the draft, you often choose to play all your premium interaction spells, people are going to end up with somewhere between 6, 7, 8 removal spells in their deck instead. Your non-creature slots in this format are generally like a battle or two, and then like 6 or 7 or 8 removal spells. That is what most people's decks are going to consist of. And when I'm talking efficient removal spells, I'm not just talking, one of the better removal spells in the set is Deadly Derision, which is a full 4 mana. That's like not prohibitive, but it's also not what I would call ultimately efficient. We've got stuff like the best interaction spell in the format, or at least at common, Afara's Dispersal, which is the 2 and a blue instant. you bounce something and it costs 2 less if it targets an attacking creature, and then you Surveil 2. We've got Final Flourish as a 2 mana, -2, -2. You can sacrifice a artifact or creature to kick it, give something -6, -6. Cosmic Hunger, even the green gets really good interaction spells here. And one I want to shout out here, actually, that's been creeping up and up and up, and actually I think is very underrated at this point. Probably the most underrated common right now, Assimilate Essence. So this is the 1 in a blue instant. Counter target creature or battle spell unless its controller pays 4. And if they do pay that 4, you incubate 2. So just small side note on this before I get to the, talk about the other efficient removal spells. This is just a really good card in the format. This may remind you of Scatter Ray from Brothers War, but format context makes this way, way better. So number one, in Brothers War, there was a lot of things that punished this card. This kind of effect, it's kind of like mana leak unless they pay 4 kind of thing. It really is good in formats where people are casting expensive spells. And people are doing that in this format. A lot of the bombs are quite expensive. This is one of the most efficient answers to those bombs. In Brothers War, the expensive cards, the prototype creatures, that mechanic panned out to be not as good, or at least, you didn't cast them for 8, 9 mana, you cast them more for their 3 or 4 mana, and so a lot of the cards you wanted to counter, you just couldn't with that card. And Power Stones, of course, mattered too, that those were lying around and helped pay for this cost. Also, Unearth punished it in that format. In this format, there's a lot less that punishes that, and you do end up keeping this in your hand for a while, sometimes if you want to anticipate a bomb coming, but it's also just really good on turn 2. Trade it their 2-drop. In the mid game, you can double spell with it, right? You cast a creature, hold this up on turn 5 with your 5 mana, and you get ahead on tempo, right? You get to counter their 5-drop or their 4-drop, and you've also played something. And of course, not to say anything about the Incubate 2, that is a nice little buyout clause on this. On top of that, if you've been paying any attention to the format, blue control is just really, really good. So you have a lot of instants to pair with this, so you're not just stuck with this in your hand. You're not just like, well, I could pass the turn with this in my hand, maybe nab something, but that means I can't play my creature this turn. You can just hold this up, and if they don't cast anything, you can cast a draw spell, or maybe you do cast an interaction spell. And Assimilate Essence, just to give you a baseline here, it's currently in the top 10 commons on 17 lands. Now, that's a little bit because you get this, close to dead last. I think a lot of people are not looking at this card. But anyways, that all aside, back to just talking about efficient answers, Assimilate Essence being one of them, all these 1, 2, and 3 mana interaction spells, that really frames how you want to play the games. Because in a normal game of Limited or in another format, you might expect, like I mentioned, your opponent has a few removal spells, and you play your 4-drop, and maybe it sticks, maybe it doesn't. You play your bomb, maybe it sticks, maybe it doesn't. You should expect your first threat to die. And you should probably expect your second and third threat to die as well. And that really frames a lot of how I'm playing the games. And if you think about the format in that context of your stuff is going to die, it makes sense, and it really helps you kind of contextualize why certain cards are good or not so good. So 2 cards I would point to that are huge overperformers in this format are Cyber Cryptomancer and Unseal the Necropolis. Cyber Cryptomancer, of course, being the 1 in a blue 0/1 with flash and hexproof. Backup 1, and whenever you target the thing with backup, that thing gains hexproof. The reason this card is such an overperformer, and again, this is one of the top commons in the set, top 10 commons right now on 17 lands, I'm happy playing multiple of this card, is you can reliably say in the majority of your games, your opponent will be pointing a removal spell at one of your creatures in the first 5, 6, 7 turns of the game, maybe even multiple, and that's why you're happy playing multiple, because, the reason that these kind of effects they're good in a lot of formats, right, like kind of Snakeskin Veil sort of variant, but you can't load your deck with them like you kind of can with this card, is that, your opponents are going to be playing mostly creatures and combat tricks a lot of the time. A lot of figuring out what makes a good Magic card in a given format is figuring out what the most commonly played cards are, and having cards that line up well against those kind of cards, and Cyber Cryptomancer is exactly that. And another card here, kind of similar thing. Unseal the Necropolis, 2 in a black instant. Each player mills 3 cards, then you return up to 2 creature cards from your graveyard to your hand. If your stuff dies, it's not going to have the exact same play patterns as Cyber Cryptomancer, but you're more okay just being like, all right, I ran out my premium 4-drop. If you kill it, that's okay, because I'm going to get it back. And both these cards unseal a little bit less. I'm very happy with the first copy. The second copy, maybe not as much, but Cryptomancer, definitely. I'm happy to play multiple. And another thing that if you just have that framework of your stuff will die, really kind of highlights why some creatures in this format are not particularly good. So this is a concept that you might be familiar with if you are, a Constructed player or have been playing Magic for a while. But in Constructed, your expensive cards really have to do something, have a huge impact. Your expensive creatures when they come down. There's a reason why, 5 mana 10/10, which is a card they printed before, doesn't see playing constructed. Because you know what happens to that thing? It just dies, because people are playing a lot of really efficient removal. Now, we're not to that point in this format just yet. People aren't going to have 10, 11, 12 removal spells a lot of the time. Although sometimes you face blue-black and they do actually have that. But what that means is you have to be extremely picky about what 4+ mana value creatures you put in your deck. And I know this kind of sounds like a hot take, kind of sounds a bit extreme, but the vast majority of creatures that cost 4 or more and don't have an enter the battlefield effect or haste, that kind of counts, are going to make your deck worse then they're going to make them better, even if they read pretty well. So I have an example here. Renata, Called to the Hunt. This is the 2/3, X3. Its power is equal to your devotion, and whenever another creature enters the battlefield under your control, it enters with a counter. Okay, so this card reads pretty well, right? You're like, okay, I play this, and then all my future creatures are going to get bigger. The problem with this is this comes in, and so much of the time, your opponent's going to have one of those super efficient removal spells, and it's just gonna die or get bounced. And from a tempo perspective, when you're trading your 4 mana or 5 mana card that doesn't have an enter the battlefield effect, you didn't get any value for their 2 or 1 mana interaction spell, that puts you way, way far behind. And that's gonna happen with regularity. So I bring up Renata in particular because that card has a very, very low win rate on 17 lands right now. It's winning at like 50%. And that's very low for the 17 lands player base, right? That's like usually like a C level card is going to win at about 56% in this format. And that's multiple percentage points lower. And I've had a lot of people in my stream just say, hey, why isn't this card doing so well? Why don't you pick this card early? I never want Renata in my deck. And again, it sounds a little bit like hyperbole, but I would really, really try not to. I mean, maybe it's a 23rd card, but I know a lot of people look at this card and go, very, very powerful. But you just have that dynamic going on where you can't afford to play a 4 or 5 mana card that doesn't do anything when it enters. A few other cards here. War Train Slasher. This is the 3 in a red 3/4 menace that whenever you attack a battle, you double its power. 4 mana 4/3 menace in a lot of format, that would be a beater. That'd be like, wow, that's like pretty good. Again, you play this, your opponent casts a 2 mana interaction spell and also does something else. You start to fall behind very quickly if you that one thing you played, if that happens once, you're like, all right, that kind of hurt, but I can maybe come back from that. If that happens a second time with a second interaction spell, so much worse. And another thing I would note is the expensive Convoke creatures. Something like Thunderhead Squadron, this is the 6 mana, 5 and a blue 3/4 flyer with Convoke. This is even worse a lot of the time, because if you have to tap your creatures, sorcery speed, Convoke this thing out, not only are you playing, probably 4 or 5 mana for this generally, but you've also tapped your other creatures, which makes the tempo blow even worse. And I talked last week about how Preening Champion and Afara's Dispersal, those cards look good, but not amazing to a lot of people. But I just said, if you just keep taking these cards, you will win more. It's the same with this concept, I think. If you just stop playing 4 and 4+ mana value cards that don't have an enter the battlefield effect, you will start winning more. A good example, another one, kind of like Renata, Azuri, Claw of Progress. This is the mythic 2 green blue 3/3. When a creature with power 2 or less enters the battlefield under your control, you get an experience counter. At the beginning of combat on your turn, you put a +1/+1 counter, X +1/+1 counters on another target creature you control, where X is the number of experience counters you have. That card reads really powerfully. It's doing even worse than Renata, to be honest, right? And this is the exact kind of thing you're like, well, that looks perfectly fine. I think it's exactly because this dynamic, you don't want to be putting these cards in your deck. And the thing I would say, going back to the Preening Champion thing, where it's just like, just keep putting these cards in your deck, it's the opposite of this. Even if the card reads pretty well, don't. Like I really would highly recommend don't put those cards in your deck. There's exceptions, and the exceptions are going to be the cards that, if you untap with them, you are really unsurmountably ahead. Something like Kenrith, something like Grimgrin, the mythics and rares, basically. But that's the exception to the rules. Be judicious about those cards, and if you want some baselines here, if you want, don't take my word, if you don't want to take my word for it, just go on 17 lands and look at all those cards that fit that description. 4 mana and above cards that don't have an immediate impact. And when I say immediate impact, it could draw a card, right? It could bounce something. It doesn't have to be like, it doesn't have to be, I kill something when I come in. All it has to do is gain some life or give you some value of some kind. All the cards that don't do that are performing terribly. Like, actually terribly. Makes your deck worse when you play the cards. So just keep that in mind. Okay, so that's the first big picture thing I want to talk about today that frames the format. The second one is tempo blowouts lose the game. I was joking on stream this week that the format is really just about flipping your Phyrexian transform cards at the right time and blowing out your opponent's transform cards just when they go to flip it. And that's a really clear-cut example of a tempo blowout, but that's a lot of the games are like, I find. It's not even just when your opponent casts a Phyrexian and, they play a Nezumi Freewheeler, the 4-mana 3/3 menace that when it ETBs, each player mills 3, and it's got like a 5 and a Phyrexian white activated ability turns into a 4/5 menace that reanimates a 2-cost permanent. Like, that reads like a powerful card. But when my opponent plays a Nezumi Freewheeler, I'm just licking my lips. I'm like, yes, I can't wait till the opportunity for you to go to flip it and IFR's Dispersal it, right? So finding those moments is going to be critical for winning a lot of games. I think that games are won and lost in this format by those kind of mid-game tempo blowouts. So again, this goes back to, I mentioned this last week, but these expensive flip Phyrexians, really be careful about which ones you put in your deck, and I would recommend not putting those expensive ones in your deck with expensive activation costs. If you do happen to have them in your deck, be very careful about when you activate them. I never want to activate these into open mana, right? And once again, you can kind of predict when your opponent might do that and kind of set up for that and blow them out. And again, just to back this up, if you go on 17 lands and look at these expensive flip Phyrexians compared to the cheap flip Phyrexians, you see a very clear pattern. All the cheap ones, the ones that flip for like 3 in a Phyrexian, are performing quite well, and the ones that flip for 5 or 4 in a Phyrexian, there's some cases where the 4 in a Phyrexian isn't so bad, but especially 5 in a Phyrexian, are not doing very well at all. So just a little bit to more back up this kind of context, a little bit to back up this frame of mind. But it's not just about the flip Phyrexians, it's just like a really clear-cut example. When your opponent, for example, goes to back up a creature, you can blow them out there. It's not a huge blowout, but you bounce the thing that they backed up, or you kill the thing that they backed up, and now the thing that's left behind, the creature left behind, is a little bit smaller. And this concept is kind of why I think the aggro decks are really suffering in this format, why red and white aggro aren't that good, is because that aggro decks fundamentally, they thrive on being more efficient than your opponent. And when the answers are as efficient as they are in this set, it just doesn't work that well. They go to equip something, you're like, sorry, nope, IFR's Dispersal, right? That's just a huge problem. Quickly, just some commentary on this set. I love this set. I think it's a really great set. Very well designed in a lot of ways. One of my complaints with it, though, is I think that the answers are a little bit pushed. Like, I think IFR's Dispersal, if I'm to, like, put my game designer hat on quickly, if it reduced by 1 instead of 2, that would be a bit more appropriate, I think. I feel like so many of the games just hinge on those kind of moments. Counters are another good example, right? Putting +1/+1 counters on something. Your opponent, like, put some counters on something, and you IFR's Dispersal, or you Temporal Cleansing, put it back on top of their library, and it's just like, what am I doing here? I play my aggro deck. The axis that I'm hoping my aggro decks to work on just fundamentally doesn't work in this format. And going back to Cyber Cryptomancer, kind of the same thing, right? Not all the removal is 1, 2, and 3 mana. Some of it, like Deadly Derision or some other things, are a bit more expensive. And when you can get a tempo blowout with Cryptomancer, you're trading your 2 mana for their, 5, or maybe they have like a Shatter the Source or something, or they tap all their creatures. That is a huge tempo blowout as well. So, I think a lot of people might be framing this at a bit like, oh, it's all about grindy card advantage. And that's true for some, to some extent. Yes, like, definitely there are a lot of games that come down to a resource war. Who has more cards in hand? Who gets more 2-for-1s? But tempo plays a large part of this too. It's not just like, oh, I drew more cards than you did. Tempo, it's almost like a yin and yang kind of thing, right? Like, you can't have one without the other. They kind of work in tandem. So really, if you're somebody who is maybe focusing on the card advantage, expensive bomb side of the format, consider how much tempo plays a part as well. And then my third big picture concept that I've been thinking about this week as far as gameplay is concerned is, I guess what I'm calling like swing mitigation, or mitigating the swingy aspect of the format. I've heard a lot of people describe this format as swingy, and like, to some extent, certainly. It's like, okay, they played a very impactful card and I was pretty ahead, but then it's like, oh, well, they played that and now I'm way behind. Or, like we were at parity. This is more accurate, I think. It's like we were at parity, you played one card and you were so much further ahead than I was. What happened here? And how to kind of reconcile that, how to deal with that. I would really say that keeping pace with the opponent is something that I think about a lot. And what does that mean? Well, it means that when they play a threat, a premium 2-drop, you gotta answer that. They play a Blight Reaper Thallid on 2, or they play a Skyclave Aerialist on 2, and you're like, I could just ignore that, but if I have a removal spell on turn 2, I'm just firing that thing off, because those cards do start to snowball. Another example is, I'm playing this blue-black control deck, and I was planning on turn 3 to just like cast a card draw spell. My opponent wasn't, they didn't play a 2-drop, and they cast a Preening Champion instead, right? Well, if I don't answer that with my cheap interaction spell that I'm going to hopefully have multiple of, I'm going to start to fall behind. This is why printing champions so good, because you can't 1-for-1 with the card. They're going to be left with something. But it's that kind of thing. I think a lot of the games I've seen, the swinginess really, you really feel it's really palpable, is when one player, they make a play that has them fall behind on board just a little bit, right? And then the opponent uses that opportunity. Again, they leverage the opponent going, oh, you didn't affect the board this turn? Great. I get to leverage that and slam my bomb. Or the other thing is, if you fall too far behind and you have to catch up, use a bunch of removal spells on their just kind of cheap creatures that you didn't answer in the early game, then you're left with no removal to deal with their actual bombs, right? So that's a big thing too. I would think about this swing mitigation tactic as, you know, if you've ever watched Pro Tour coverage, they kind of have this advantage bar where, you know, if both players are at parity, that advantage bar is right in the middle. And once somebody starts to pull ahead, it goes their direction, and maybe they start to fall behind and it goes the opposite way. You want to keep that advantage bar in the middle as long as possible. And what that advantage bar in the middle means is getting on board when your opponent gets on board. Not taking too much additional damage, right? Me and Mark on our set review, we talked about the concept of using your life total as a resource up to a certain point. Like, I would say like the first 8 points of your life points you can use as a resource. But once you get to like the 12 to 8 points, that starts to really impact what decisions you can make. Because if you're at 4, well, you have to block their thing. Whereas if you're at 15, maybe you can just take it and not have to block with your premium creature. So don't fall too behind on life. Don't fall too behind on board. Answer the board. Just keeping pace. Don't, if somebody, you know, if you were plopped into a Pro Tour game, don't let Marshall say, yeah, that person, they're falling way behind the advantage bar, right? The card advantage aspects of the format, like, those will come later. A good heuristic, just in general, I think in Magic, is play to the board before you cast anything that's not affecting the board. Your card draw is always kind of going to do its thing, where if you cast your card draw early, you might have time to reap the rewards of those benefits. And this might not sound exactly tied to, oh, the bombs of the format, the swinging nature, but it really does, I think, because if you're keeping pace, if you're keeping your life total high, you're matching your opponent 1-for-1. Number one, well, if suddenly they start to run out of gas, you're like, oh, great, now I can leverage that. I can leverage my position. I still have gas in hand. And since I was, you know, keeping pace with them, I can start to turn the corner. But the other thing is, when your opponent does resolve a bomb, if you are behind, even by like a turn, you're like, I'm a little bit behind here. They had a really good turn last time. I couldn't meet them, couldn't match them on board. That bomb that they play, that Glissa, that's going to dominate, absolutely. But if you've matched them pace for pace, okay, you know, the Glissa is going to be a problem, especially if you don't have a removal spell right now. And, you know, of course, if you don't have a removal spell right now, Glissa is probably going to win. But say you're tapped out, they play a Glissa, they incubate 2, and it's like, all right, I got to kill the thing. They're going to have those tokens lying around, but it's not an insurmountable advantage. I can come back from that, right? It's going to take a little bit of work, but you can come back from that. So that's kind of how I'm thinking about it. And don't even think about it so much as reacting to your opponent, because sometimes, you know, you will be reactive, you're a controlling deck, but sometimes you're the one who wants to start playing those premium 2-drops as you can, so that your opponent is forced to keep pace. They can't cast their Invasion of Omnicat on turn 3. They have to maybe be mana inefficient, right? They have to kill your Aerialist, your Skyclave Aerialist on turn 3 with their 2-mana removal spell, make them play off curve a little bit, because if your thing sticks, you can then play a 3-drop and you start to snowball. So that's kind of how I'm thinking about the pacing of how the games play out in this format. I think once you get to the middle point of the games, where it's like, all right, turn 5, turn 6, you know, you then probably have to plan a little bit differently and be like, well, I've kept pace, now I have to anticipate some bombs or some expensive cards coming down. That's a little bit different. What I'm talking about is really like the early parts of the game. That's how you can really, I think, mitigate that swingy feeling you feel, because you do really, really feel it. The game just feels over when you're a little bit behind and your opponent plays a bomb. All right, so those are my like 3 big picture concepts. Just diving a little bit deeper into a few other things. I do want to talk about how to play with and play against bombs in this format, because they are a big part of the format. And I'm kind of classifying bombs into a bunch of kind of subcategories. So there's one kind of bomb that if you stick it, you'll just win, right? Glissa is a good example. I think Quintorius, Lore Master, the 3 red, white, 3/5 Vigilance, that at the beginning of your end step, you can exile a non-creature, non-land from your graveyard. You make a 3/2 spirit token, and then you can pay 3 mana to sack the spirit and recast that spell that you exiled. Like, these cards, if they stick around for a turn or two, they're just going to win the game. And in a lot of formats, you can actually have some confidence just being like, hey, I just slammed this, and what's the chance my opponent's going to have a removal spell that answers this? Well, you know, they might have one, but maybe they use one on turn 3 to kill something else, and because they're only going to have, like I said, that average of like 3 or 4 removal spells in their deck, it's not that likely they're going to answer it. So I think in another format, I would just slam my bomb, just on turn 5 all the time. My Glissa on turn 5. But in this format, when you have one of these kind of if it sticks, you win bombs, I really try to play my early turns taxing my opponent's removal. And what I mean by that is you want to kind of draw it out, right? You want to, this is why those 2-drops are so good, the Captive Weirds, the Thalids, the Skyclave Aerialist, because they demand an answer early, they tax your opponent's interaction spells, and then you can play these cards and you do start to take over. So just some heuristics for this kind of card, these kind of like 5-mana expensive ones. I would say don't just play them on turn 5 all the time. In some formats, like I said, you will do that, but if you have a comparable thing to play, if you've got like a Tangled Skyline, for example, right? The 5-mana green enchantment, you gain 5 life, your Phyrexians have reach, you incubate 5. I'll probably play that first instead of my Glissa, because especially if they have open mana, right? That's a big thing too. I'll probably play that first instead of playing my Glissa, especially if they do have some open mana, because they'll probably have to answer that first. So the more things you can tax your opponent's interaction spells with, the less likely it is they're going to have something else to actually answer your game winner. Now, what I wouldn't do is, if you don't have a better play, I wouldn't hold Glissa. I would still just play the Glissa. Like, that playing that Tangled Skyline, that is, I'm doing that with the thought that, hey, this is something they do have to answer. If instead you play just like a 2-mana creature and you're not using your mana all your mana that turn, they're not going to have to play an interaction spell, right? They're just going to be like, okay, sure, I'll just save this. At least a good player will. And then it doesn't actually work out. But if you are in a spot where it's just like, all right, you know what, I have other spots to play, do try to kind of eke that removal out of their hand first. And it's not just about putting out threats that your opponent has to kill, because, you know, you don't always have just like awesome threats to just go threat. Sometimes I'll want to induce my opponent into using an interaction spell if I have a bomb in hand. So, for example, maybe I'll have kind of like a tempting double block, right? Your opponent attacks at the 3/3, you block with your Preening Champion and something else. And that Preening Champion, it's something that your opponent will respect. It's a 2/2 flyer. Maybe they're thinking, okay, well, I can't let the thing stick around. It's pecking in for me for a few points, and maybe they might play a battle. If you do make that double block and your opponent has an interaction spell, I'd say it's pretty likely they're going to use their Final Flourish to win that combat, because they're like, yeah, I went ahead on tempo. So, you know, I'm not going to do that all the time. If you're low on resources, you can't afford to just be like, here, take this 2 for an opponent. But if I have 3, 4, 5 spells in hand, I'm going to induce my opponent into using their interaction spells there in some spots, so that Glissa is more likely to stick. Second class of bombs here, those were the ones that you want to have them stick and you'll win. I'm calling these like the card advantage bombs, something like Gyruda, Doom of Depths, the 6-mana 6/6 that mills 4 cards when ETBs for both players, then you put a even mana cost creature onto the battlefield under your control. Atris, Oracle of Half-Truths, 2 blue-black for a 3/2 menace. When it ETBs, target opponent looks at the top 3 cards of your library, and then they separate into 2 piles. You get to pick one of the piles. And these kind of cards, you should just run out. Just like, you know, of course, they give you value. You don't mind if this gets answered, because even if they do answer it, well, you get something left over, hopefully. Now, one thing I will say is this still does apply, that kind of tease your opponent's removal spells out. That applies to this card if they're playing blue. If you think they have counter spells, maybe they've been playing in a way where it's like, they've been keeping that 2 mana up for a long time. They might have Assimilate Essence. I haven't given them a good target to Assimilate Essence yet. I think it's pretty likely. Or they've been not attacking with their flyer. And it's like, why didn't they do that? Well, they might have Artistic Refusal, which is the Convoke 6-mana counter spell. So, you know, I think you can still apply that concept I was talking about a second ago to these more card advantage-y, good enter the battlefield effects bombs. But, you know, for the most part, just run them out, especially if your opponent's not playing blue. The third class of bombs here that I want to talk about is kind of the I play it and I accrue value over time, or whenever I do X, I get something. Good examples of this: Chrome Host Seed Shark. This is the 2 and a blue 2/4 flyer. Whenever you cast a non-creature spell, you incubate X, where X is that spell's mana value. Lurrus the Dream Den. This is the 1 Hybrid Orzhov 3/2 lifelink companion that you can cast a spell, a 2-cost permanent out of your grave each turn. Monastery Mentor, the 2 and a white 2/2 prowess. Whenever you cast a non-creature spell, you make a monk token. These kind of cards, I would suggest not playing on turn 3. The Seed Shark is actually kind of an interesting one, because there's actually not a lot of things that kill the Seed Shark. Like, 2/4 is pretty big, but at the same time, for all of these cards, these cheap ones, right, they're all pretty cheap. I would hope to double spell with them on some turn. So play them on turn 5 and cast a spell. Play Lurrus on turn 5, cast a 2-cost permanent out of your grave. Ideally, if you can, you go Siege Arc on 5, hold up my Cyber Cryptomancer. That's the ultimate way of playing with it, right? But you don't want to give your opponent an opportunity to just cleanly nab these. You want to get some value out of it. Now, of course, there's going to be some spots you just can't do that. You're under pressure. You got to play your Lurrus. You got to play your Mentor. Maybe you even have to block with your Monastery Mentor. But I would say, unlike Glissa, like I was talking about, well, if you have nothing better to do, just slam it on turn 5 because, you have to do something. I would say as long as you're not under pressure, I probably wouldn't play these cards on turn 3. Like I said, maybe Siege Arc's not the greatest example, but Lurrus, for sure. Mentor, I would try not to. If I had nothing else to do, I might consider playing it out, but I would play a lesser thing first. I mean, that same concept applies, like I was talking about earlier. But with these cards, I would actually consider playing nothing if they don't, if your opponent's not on board, or if you have a 2-drop that you can trade with their 3-drop next turn, right? Be a bit more careful about when you actually play these. Okay, so that's playing with the bombs. Now let's talk about playing against the bombs. So this is a format that you do want to hold your interaction spells, right? Don't be tempted just to kill their 4-mana 4/4. Try to find some other way to deal with that. Double block, or just maybe you take a few hits from that a few times, because in most decks there's going to be 3 or 4 really good cards lurking. So when your opponent does play an Archpriest of Shadows, which is the 5-mana 4/4 backup 1 Death Touch, and then when it deals combat damage, or the thing you backed up, you return a creature card from the graveyard to the battlefield. Thalia and the Gitrog monster, or just any of these cards that they're pretty good, but they do have to stick around for a turn, or they have to they have to have a clean hidden in the case of Archpriest. If you just have that removal spell in hand, maybe you don't have that instant speed removal spell, but you untap and you can just kill it. They play their Archpriest, and maybe you have to make an awkward chump or something so they don't get their trigger, but then you untap, you cast that removal spell, you carry on with your life. So really, I guess I would say the last removal spell you have in hand, I'm very careful about where I point that and when I use it. I either have to use it on, if your opponent just keeps presenting these premium threats, yeah, you of course have to cast them. You have to cast the last one. Or if you're very, very close to closing out the game, or you think you can really leverage your board and kill them in 2 turns, then maybe it's okay, I do just cast my removal, so we'll get that 4/4 out of the way, attack them for 8. That certainly happens. But I've seen a lot of opponents just go kill your medium 2-drop, kill your medium 3-drop, and I just go, all right, now I play my bomb, and they're oh, okay. So, it's the classic, I think a lot of times in modern limited, you just can't hold your interaction spells for too long, because especially in some of the more recent sets, the 2 and the 3-drops have been super, super threatening. I mean, the 1-drops too. You kind of just had to kill your opponent's Evolving Adaptive in Phyrexia when they played it. But in this set, there are some premium cheap creatures that you do want to get rid of for sure, but I would just say have some patience. So, some of those cheap creatures like Marshal of Zhalfir, which is the blue-white Night Lord, the 2/2 that gives your knights +1/+1. Skyclave Aerialist, like I mentioned before, sure. You got to use your interaction spells on those when you can, because they are going to start to snowball. But anything else, just save them. Just really just save them. And then, I don't want to gloss over the fact, I don't want to hand wave the fact that not all the bombs can be answered by removal spells. Some of the absolute best cards of the set, like Sunfall, like Atali, those are going to be trickier, right? You can't just 1-for-1 with them, but you can kind of anticipate them in a lot of ways, right? Your opponent has been playing a little funky. They haven't played to the board and they're playing white. Well, yeah, maybe you don't commit that last creature. Maybe you don't wake up your Incubate token, right? And there are ways to play around these cards. And look, I'm not saying it's going to work all the time, but I do think that I've gotten opponents by them just maybe not thinking about these kind of cards, right? Maybe not thinking, oh, we should play around this rare. And I do think you should play around these kind of rares to some extent. Atali is another one where it's all right, maybe instead of playing my 6-drop this turn, I do hold up a counter spell instead, because they've had some cards stuck in hand and they're in red. Maybe it's interaction spells, but they could have killed my stuff, and I had some pretty good stuff here. That's kind of good. The alarm bell kind of goes off for me there, right? And maybe they don't, maybe they don't have it, and you carry on with your life. But I do think that there is a way, once again, to mitigate these bombs in a way. I don't want to say that they're not a problem. They certainly are, but it's not like there's zero way to play around them. And I've beaten a lot of Sunfalls just by kind of sniffing them out. If you don't give them full value, then it isn't as bad. They wipe your board. You kill their thing if you can, their Incubate token, you carry on. Another point I would bring up here is don't scoop early. This is a format where I've had some wild comebacks. I'm sure you might have also. I'm sure your opponents have as well. I think when your opponent plays an awesome bomb, you kind of get the wind knocked out of your sails. You're like, oh, nothing I could have done. I throw in the towel. I'm a player who is, I stay in the game. I've got some of that Reed Duke energy going on sometimes where like, I'm just going to stay in as long as possible because, there's always that 5% chance. I would say that if you're somebody who's prone to like scooping early, this format, you're going to lose a lot of games in this format that you might have been able to win. So I have an example here. You might have even seen this if you follow the Limited Level Ups YouTube, or if you're watching it on the Limited Level Ups YouTube right now. I had a game where I had not much on board. I had a Halo Charge Scob, just the 5 mana 4/4 in blue, and my opponent had 4 creatures on board. I was at 15. Their creatures were all pretty large, like 3/5, 3/3, 3/4. They cast an Atali. Okay, well, that was really, really bad for me, obviously, right? Them casting Atali, they flipped 2 good cards, and now I'm just like, okay, and this was on stream, and I even just said, okay, let's see it. The opponent can have their fun, but, we're probably going to scoop next turn. And for what it's worth, I had some interaction spells in hand, but I couldn't deploy them all and kill all the stuff. I didn't have a clean answer to Atali, and so I just felt like there wasn't really, in the moment at least, I felt there wasn't really a way forward. But then I stopped, and I just said, okay, you know what? I'm still at 15. I can take a hit. There are other creatures aside from Atali. They actually don't get past my 4/4 here. And if they try to attack all, I can take the 7 from Atali, kill a few things, because I do have a few interaction spells I can deploy. And then I'm like, okay, well, and then from there, it's still going to be hard to win. But let's see if there is a way in my deck. And then I looked at the library count. This game had been going on for a while. And I was like, we're both really low. And I have a few cards that do mill both players. So my game plan was, I survive a few more turns, I manage this Atali, and then I just mill them out. And that worked. And that was a surprise to me. So I'm sure there's going to be a lot of games where your opponent plays a bomb, you get that, like I said, you get that wind knocked out of your sails, and you're like, nothing I could have done. I would just recommend like flexing that mental fortitude muscle, because you're going to encounter good cards every single game. And if you do just scoop when you see a pretty good card, you're going to scoop a lot of the time, basically. All right, and just before we do get into some of the specific cards I want to talk about, I just want to cover what I'm calling like my draft blueprint for this format. So I've been working with a few Pro Tour players, getting people prepared for the upcoming Pro Tour. And one of the bigger questions that I've had is, okay, well, how do you navigate this format where there's just a lot of really good cards? You open up your pack and you're like, wow, there's 5 cards I could take here. And this is my general layout of how I like to draft this format. I think just kind of a blueprint you can map onto most of your drafts. Basically, blue and black are awesome, so I want to try to start there if I can. And take good blue-black cards. Sometimes it's going to just work out, especially on Arena right now. I think blue is still incredibly underdrafted. I think that the general Arena population has a tough time evaluating what makes a good blue card in general. Like, there's been a lot of sets where blue has been the best color, and it's remained that way for the rest of the format because people just don't value, like, the blue. I was talking about the blue bounce a thing, draw a card kind of cards that we see. Those cards go really, really late. Even Preening Champion, which is a fantastic card, I think people haven't caught on that it's that, like, amazing, you should take it over most of the bombs in the set. So, if you can get your way into blue, which I think it's not like it's super cut or anything, you can definitely try to do that. Get your way into black if you can. Early on, take the good black and blue commons and uncommons. If those 2 colors aren't open, the next thing I would look to do is, maybe you did pick up some good blue and black cards, I would then try to move into green, and maybe you're like a green-black or green-blue splish-splash deck, where you're closer to 3 colors, or 2 colors and a bit of a splash, and that's a good way to play your first picks, but also not try to just shoehorn yourself into blue-black, because, there's definitely a fail case. You can have some really bad blue-black decks if you just force it all the way, right? So you can draft green, not just for the mana fixing, but to have a secondary color that is pretty open. And if those 3 aren't open, then white and red, which are the worst colors, those will be very open, because it's very hard. Black, blue, and green are pretty deep. It's going to be hard to find a situation where those 3 aren't open and red and white aren't open too. So I'm only really willing to draft red and white in those kind of situations. Or, here's the other thing. If you open Sunfall, Elesh Norn, the 7 mana one, the Valkyrie, the Boonbringer Valkyrie, the Baneslayer Angel, or Elspeth. If you open up one of those cards in white, I am willing to go into that, especially because blue-white is one of the better decks. If you're going to be white, though, try to pair it with the black cards or the blue cards, because, again, those are quite good. And you also, if you're trying to be like a slower white deck, leveraging those bombs, you get to take advantage of some of the underdrafted white cards, like Cut Short, which is the 3-mana kill a tap creature with Convoke. And there's also Alabaster Host Intercessor, which is the land cycler, the 6-mana, 3/4 ETBs. exiles a creature on your opponent's side until that thing leaves. Like, those cards aren't great in the aggro decks, and you get to use them as the controlling deck. And then the other thing, if I'm gonna draft red, it's either gonna be absurdly open or I open Atali. That's kind of it. Atali is the one red card that I'd be like, let's draft that. And, you know, I'm still going to try to get into a good secondary color, but, that card is good enough that I would take it pick one, pack one. Like, that's one of the few cards that I would take pick one, pack one over Preening Champion, just to give you some context. All right, so that's all I have for the overview stuff. Let's get into some of those specifics. So, first thing I do want to talk about is those flip Phyrexians, like I was talking about earlier, and really just making a distinction between the good ones and the not so good ones, and also when you should transform them. So, the premium ones, at least outside of rare, are Captive Weird, single blue mana for a 1/3 defender. You pay 3 in a Phyrexian red to transform it. The backside is a 3/3 that when it transforms into this thing, you exile the top card of your library and you can play it until the end of your next turn. Blight Reaper Thallid is the 1 in the black 2/2. 3 Phyrexian green, transform it, turns into a 3/3, comes with a 1/1 Thallid friend, and then when the Blight Reaper dies, you also get a Thallid friend. And Kenner Spell Spear. This is 1 in a red 2/2 trample prowess, 3 in a Phyrexian blue. The backside is a Ward 2 2/2 trample, or sorry, 3/3 trample prowess, double prowess. And what makes these ones good, like I mentioned, is that they are cheap to activate. I don't mind activating these early. With some of the other ones that I'm going to get to in a second, you don't really want to activate them early, because what happens is if you go play my thing on 2, flip it on turn 3, if your opponent removes it on their turn, even if they don't remove it in response to you flipping and have that tempo blow like I was talking about, it's still pretty bad. Because if you don't get any value out of the card, Captive Weird and Blight Reaper Thallid, those give you value when you flip them. It's okay, because if they do untap and cast an interaction spell, not exactly no harm, no foul, but you kind of feel okay about that. Kenner Spell Spear, this is another one that's kind of interesting. You don't get value on it, but I think it's good to flip it as soon as possible. The Ward 2 really mitigates that problem that you have of, I play this, my opponent untaps, they play an interaction spell, and they also play something else that turn. Really hard for your opponent to do that when this thing has Ward 2. Now, for all 3 of these, do be careful. You still don't want to activate them into open mana, because your opponent could just go, all right, -2, Final Flourish, your Thallid. Sorry. Sorry, bud. And that is still bad. But I don't feel bad if you have nothing else to do on turn 3, flipping all 3 of these. And then just to give you some examples of the ones that are the opposite of that, Order of the Mirror. I think this one's really overrated. I've actually seen some content creators be kind of high on this card as like a kind of okay 2-drop. I think this card's really bad. I think this card has all the problems that I was just mentioning, and mentioning at the top of the show, where this is the 2 in a blue 2/1, with 3 in a Phyrexian white to transform it, and it turns into a 3/3 on the backside, where if it's blocked, the blocking creature gets -1/-1. The problem with this card is it's bad on the front side. 2/1 is much worse than 2/2 in this format. Like, it makes it, trades with a token, gets pinged off by things. There's not that much pinging, but 2/1 is meaningfully worse than a 2/2. And unlike those other ones I just talked about, when you do transform it, either on turn 3, hopefully not on turn 3, but even later in the game, your opponent's not that sad about it, because they're like, okay, cool, maybe it's a little bit difficult to block, but you're not getting any value, so you do feel like, I kind of invested all this mana for nothing. I mean, it's an okay attacker, certainly, but this does have all kind of the structural problems I was just talking about. Another one, Notvold Hermit, I mentioned this one last week. This is a 3 in a green 4/4 with 5 in a blue Phyrexian mana to flip it. Turns into a 5/5, and then whenever it attacks, it turns something else into a 5/5. That's, this is the exact kind of card like I was talking about earlier. I'm just licking my lips when my opponent plays this, because I'm like, yes, excellent. Go for that flip. I love it. Aetherblade Agent. Here's another one. I like this card, but I think you have to be careful with it. This is the 1 in a black 1/1 Death Touch, 4 in a Phyrexian blue to flip it. Turns into a 3/3 Death Touch that whenever it deals combat damage to a battle or a player, you draw a card. This card is good because the front side is fine enough, right? The front side is just a 1/1 Death Toucher that sits in the battlefield. Cool, trades in combat. You just have to be careful, because I have seen a lot of people flipping this on turn 4 into open mana and almost losing the game on the spot there, right? So basically the heuristic for these cards is, if the front side is good, then they're just good. If the flip cost is cheap and you get value out of them when you flip them, that makes it good. Noting Notvold Hermit for a second here. 4 mana 4/4. That sounds like a pretty good card, but like I said, it falls into that issue of being a 4-mana card that doesn't do anything when it enters the battlefield, and you get out-tempoed too much of the time. Moving on to battles just quickly here. So I don't have a ton to say about battles. I think it's kind of tricky to talk about them because they all do play pretty differently. But one thing I would say for all of them, or the ones you want to put in your deck anyways, is it's good to kind of surprise your opponent, or try to find a moment where you can sneak it in and flip it right away. One of the ones that you can definitely do this quite often is the Invasion of Xerix. This is the blue-white one. 2 blue-white for a 4 defense battle. When it enters the battlefield, you bounce something, and the backside is the Star Flying Knight that is equal to your power toughness equal to the number of creatures you control. If you play this when your opponent's maybe got one creature they can block with, and then you can flip it right away, that's an amazing turn for you. If instead you play this, and it's like, all right, I bounce something, and I don't get an attack, and I kind of just sits there, it's not as good because then your opponent kind of knows, and they kind of can get a better sense of what's happening in the game. It's going to be pretty difficult to flip this. I would even say, unless you're under a lot of pressure, just don't play this unless you can try to flip it that same turn. I mean, so there's going to be some spots where you do. Maybe don't is like a bit too harsh, but more times than not, I will just hold this card, wait for an opportunity where my opponent, starts to maybe try to turn the corner, and then slam this, and then start to flip it, and that's how you can kind of flip the script on a lot of games. Same thing with Invasion of Amonkhet, right? It's the mythic uncommon, 1 blue-black. Each opponent discards a card, you draw a card, both players mill 3. The backside is a 4/4 that enters the battlefield as a copy of something in the grave, and this is the same thing. If you can surprise your opponent with this, it's great. Now, I don't mind playing this on turn 3. If I have nothing else to do, I will play it on turn 3. But if I have other options, like the classic play pattern is you play Preening Champion on turn 3, and then on turn 4 or 5, you play this, you attack it, and then you attack it one more time, and then you get that flip, right? Often you do it on turn 4, especially if you have Nephara's Dispersal as well, because then you can use all your mana on that turn. So just be a little bit careful. Don't just run the battles out there, unless it's something like Invasion of Mercadia, because not all the battles are like this, and this is why it's so hard to talk about battles in general, because Invasion of Mercadia, 1 in a red, ETBs, you can discard a card if you do draw 2 cards. The backside is a 3/3 that has an activated ability, 2 in a red, tap, discard a card, you make 2 elementals, and all your creatures get +1/+0 and gain haste until end of turn. This one, like, I don't mind just playing this one and just, like, waiting around for it, and just, I'll get it eventually, basically, because you do want to get this effect, you want to filter your hand, and for what it's worth, I don't think it's terrible if you need to go, hey, I play this early, and it just sits there, and eventually I'll flip it, and it's kind of threatening your opponent. It does limit your opponent's options of what they can attack with, because they don't want you to flip your battle, but I think when the opportunity arises, try to have a bit of a sneak attack with these. Next up, we've got 2 cards that are, sort of similar-ish. Cyber Cryptomancer, which I've been talking about a lot. It's the 1 in a blue 0/1 with flash, backup 1, give something hexproof. And Scorn Bladed Berserker, single black mana, 0/1, backup 1. The creature gains the ability, 1, sacrifice this creature, draw a card. So I've been talking up the merits of Cyber Cryptomancer a lot, but just to talk about it a little bit more if maybe you're not convinced or you haven't played a lot with this card. Not only do you have that awesome blow them out on tempo moment when they go for a removal spell, or just protect a key threat, but it can win a combat. Don't be afraid to do that. Just, put the counter on something, you get the Cryptomancer sitting around, and then after that, after it's done its thing, the body is relevant, right? You can sacrifice it, you can convoke with it. One of my favorite things to do with it is put Astral Wings on it. This is the 5 mana convoke blue aura that gives the creature +2/+2 in flying, and you draw a card when it enters, so you get this, like, 2/3 flying draw card kind of thing. So that's a little kind of cute thing you can do with the body. The other card here is Scorn Blade Berserker. The reason I say these cards are kind of similar is because just like with Cyber Cryptomancer, Scorn Blade Berserker is a very flexible modular card. And this is one of the most winning black uncommons, and one of the most underrated black uncommons if you just look where people take it. And a lot of people have asked me, what's so good about this card? I don't really get it. And it is kind of a tricky card unless you've played with it and kind of see it in action. And the thing is with this card, it's just like Cryptomancer, where it's just very flexible. You can do a lot of things for it. So the use cases for it are, you put it on a creature that maybe you enable an attack, or you enable a block, and then this thing sticks around. You can chump block with it, sacrifice it, draw a card. That's not bad. It's a lot of value for, 1/1 mana. It's not, 1/1 mana is less than 2 mana. Having that installment pan really matters. Obviously, you can put it on a creature that's been like stasis fielded, or got put some sort of aura on it. Now, I do want to correct something, actually. Last week I said, oh, you can put this on something that's been Realmbreaker's Grasp, right? The 1 in a white removal spell. You can't actually do that because Grasp prevents all activated abilities. So if you do that, you'll be very sad because your thing won't actually be able to sacrifice itself. But there is a lot of cards that are kind of like that. You know, you even just something that's just sitting around, maybe a 1/1 token, sacrifice that, draw a card. Like at the base level, this card is 1 mana, trump block at some point, and sacrifice the draw card. So it's like kind of like draw a card, gain 4 life. And that's not amazing, of course, but it's also a fine baseline for the different things you can do. Like considering the different things this card can do with all those tricky things. Also in the black-red sacrifice deck, it's a key part because not only is it 2 sacrifice triggers, but it's a really cheap sacrifice outlet for you take your opponent's thing with Furnace Reigns, the active treason, you sacrifice it, you draw a card. That's just fantastic. So I don't think you want too many of these. I'd probably pay 2 max because once you start to get multiples, they do start to have some diminishing returns. But the first copy is going to be good in a lot of your black decks. Like, even just like the Thallid I was talking about, the Blight Reaper Thallid, you flip that, you put that on your Thallid token, you sacrifice that. Like, that's just a good deal, especially because you can then sacrifice this after. And just to circle back to removal here for a second, I do think I found myself casting removal on my turn a lot of the time in this format because there are a bunch of playable counter spells. There are the protection spells, not just Cyber Cryptomancer, but also Angelic Intervention. That's the white protection spell. So if you know you're going to kill something, you should just do it on your turn. Now, the times you shouldn't do it on your turn, you might consider not doing it, is when you feel like you can get some tangible advantage out of it. And this is true for most removal in general, but especially here where you do risk getting blown out on your opponent's turn. If you feel like you're at a tight part of the game where maybe you entice your opponent into making a bad attack, where it's like, okay, you've got 2 mana up, you've got a Final Flourish in hand, they don't know that, and they go, well, if I just attack with everything, and I have a burn spell in hand, I can kill them. But then you attack, or they attack, and you kill their biggest thing, you get to eat maybe something else. And that's a tangible upside, I would say. Another thing is if your opponent happens to have an equipment and you think they might go for the equip, that's a tangible benefit, being able to blow them out on there and make them waste some mana. Or, of course, if you have a counter spell, you want to hold up your counter spell or card draw spell and then have this up as well. But those are exceptions to the rule. I think it's like a 60-40, 70-30 kind of thing. I would cast my instant speed removal spell on my turn a lot of the time, especially if it's something like Cosmic Hunger, which is the 1 in a green instant. Target creature you control deals its damage equal to another creature, planeswalker, or battle. Like, not only does that get gotten by protection spells, but it also gets gotten by your opponent's own instant speed reactive spell, removing your creature in response. So that one I do cast on my turn a lot of the time. Next up, we've got Inga Runai. So this is the 3 and a blue 3/3 uncommon. When it enters the battlefield, you scry 3, and when it dies, you draw 3 cards if 3 or more cards died this turn. This is a card that so we just had the team draft, the limited resources versus Lords of Limited team draft, which we sweeped, by the way. We got them 5-1. They didn't even want to play the 3rd round. And this is a card that I think I value higher than actually anybody else on the table did, because I took my first copy of Inga in that draft fairly highly, around like 4th pick. And there happened to be 3 other Ingas at the table, and I got them all. And then one of them even wheeled, or 2 of them maybe even wheeled. Ended up in a blue-white kind of Knights deck. And even in that kind of deck, where, you think you're going to be a little more aggressive, this card is still powerful. So this card is much better than it was in Call Time. If you remember playing it in Call Time, it was kind of mediocre there. I think this is actually one of Blue's better uncommons, because here, well, number one, there's kind of just more stuff lying around on the battlefield. Boards do get clogged a little more often, so it becomes a threat a little bit more often. But the big thing is that you have more instant speed interaction spells. So getting Inga to trigger, getting that draw 3, that can be tricky sometimes, because that means that 3 things have to die. Like, if you're just considering combat, 3 things have to die in combat, and your opponent's not going to let that happen if they're smart about it. But what you can do is they're like, okay, I'm going to attack with my one thing, and you block with Inga, and because there's a lot of good instant speed interaction spells, you go, I kill another thing, that thing's died, Inga and the other creature trade, and now you draw your 3 cards. So you just get that draw 3 a lot more often. The gameplay thing I want to talk about with this card is the scrying decisions, because I think scrying is one of those tricky things for a lot of players, where they see a spell on top and they're like, well, it's better than a land, like I have 6 lands in play, and I want to scry a spell to the bottom. And but the heuristic I would give is, early in the game, you're mostly okay just topping anything. Like, it doesn't really matter, as long as it's not lands. You're like, if you don't need the lands, you're like, okay, I'll take most spells. But as the game goes on and it develops, and you understand more what the game is about, maybe you're behind on resources, maybe you really need to kill something, be a lot more selective about what you scry to the bottom. Like, in the late game, I do a lot of Inga scry 3 spells to the bottom. Because those spells, maybe it's even like a Preening Champion, a pretty good thing. It's just not what I need. I have better stuff in my deck, right? So I don't get caught in the, well, it's better than a land, because you need something specific often as the game goes on. And if you do top a card that's pretty good, but not exactly what you need, you're just one card further away from that, and that could cost you the game. That could be the difference, right? Next up, we got Tetsuka Umezawa, 1 in a blue for a 1/3. Creatures you control with power toughness 1 cannot be blocked. Love this card. Great card. I talked it up last week. One thing I do want to mention, though, is if you've got a bunch of 1/1s or X1s, be very careful about it, because it can be, especially if you've gotten a few turns already, and you're like, oh, great, I'm getting with my Tetsuko, my 3 1/1s, this is great. And there's going to come a point sometimes when the opponent will have an interaction spell, and if they kill your Tetsuko, then all your 1/1s are going to die too, or your X1s, if they have bigger creatures. So do be careful about that. It's kind of hard to suss out exactly when they might have those. Like, if you've attacked a few turns in a row, you can kind of course, suss it that they don't, but always anticipate it's something that could happen. And going back to the kind of the keeping pace with the opponent, anticipating, the advantage bar where this game's going, one of the things that's really helped me is just kind of having a mental checklist of, they could have this, they could have this, they could have this. And it might not even be a specific spell, just a class of spells. Like, they could have a combat trick, they could have a removal spell, they could have a creature that they couldn't cast, and they could just have drawn lands, right? And once you kind of have that in your head, as the game goes on, you can narrow down what they don't have. And you can really kind of figure out by process of elimination, well, they didn't kill my Tetsuko, so it's not a removal spell. And, they didn't play a land for 3 turns in a row, so it's not a land. They gotta have some spells. And you can kind of just figure that kind of stuff out. So that's a general tip, but that applies to when you want to attack with Tetsuko. Because sometimes, if you do think process of elimination, it has to be a removal spell, you do want to attack with Tetsuko just alone. And eventually, especially if they're kind of low in life, they will go, all right, I killed the Tetsuko. I know you're not going to attack with your 1/1s. And what you can do to test the water sometimes is what I do. I attack with Tetsuko plus 1 thing, right? Because, if you lose 1 of your creatures, it's not the worst thing. You lose a token, okay, cool. But if you lose all of them, you do feel pretty bad about that. So just be careful. Next up, we got Temporal Cleansing. So this is 3 in a blue for a sorcery with Convoke. The owner of target non-land permanent puts it in their library, second from the top or on the bottom of their library. So pretty good blue removal spell. I like this card quite a bit. One thing to note about it is, just put it on the top. You top one of your opponent's awesome cards, and you're like, well, they're just going to draw it in a few turns. Because there's so much self-mill, or milling the opponent in black, often they do both, right? Black and blue have the self-mill theme. Do be careful about those times, or be aware of those times that you can go, cleansing your thing, and the next turn I cast my Unsealed Necropolis, and I mill your creatures, right? That's a line that happens. One cool line I did was, I was playing blue-black control, and my opponent had a Sword of Once and Future, right? The protection from blue and black spell. And that's a real big pain for my deck, right? Everything becomes a threat. I can't interact with their stuff. But what I could do is Temporal Cleansing, the actual sword. And then I got to mill them. I ended up still losing that game because that card's very good. But, that was a line, and that's a line that you can look out for. Next up, we've got Nezumi Informant. So this is the 1 in a black 1/1. That when it enters the battlefield, each opponent discards a card. So, tips for playing with this yourself. Be pretty happy just to run this out at any point in the game. I know some players might think, oh yeah, like I could wait until they have 1 card in hand, but sometimes you miss your window and they've got like, you go, I could play this, they got 3 cards in hand, I'll wait 1 turn, and they just dump their hand. And you're like, oh crap, well, no, this doesn't do anything. I would consider playing this earlier rather than later, because yes, you don't get the last card out of their hand, which can sometimes be something really good, but I talked about this card last week and how discard is good in this format because your opponents are going to be reticent to discard lands. Lands are important. There's a lot of stuff to do with your mana. Kind of the same thing. If you can strike them on resources early, that's a pretty good thing to do. You don't mind them discarding a land. You don't mind them discarding a spell. And it also just sticks around for convoking or sacrificing or whatever. Playing against this card is a little bit different. So when your opponent's playing black, this is definitely a format where you want to keep, a land in hand so that if they play a Nezumi Informant, you just have to discard a land. I've been gotten by this going like, okay, just play up my land, forgetting this card existed, and then I had to discard my Elesh Norn or whatever it is. It's like, oh well, that's just terrible. And I guess that in that situation, it's a little bit different because I do want to play my land drops. I'm incentivized to. But let's say you have a card that you're just holding in hand, right? It's something that you could play, but you're deciding not to right now. Definitely hold that land. Also, if you're splashing, and this is just a cross format thing, always there's some temptation to be like, well, I'm a blue-green deck splashing some red. I'm gonna hold this mountain for a while so they don't know I have a red splash. That's sort of an intangible benefit. Like, yes, it's good that they don't know, like, obviously it's strict upside that they don't know you have a red source in your hand and you're not gonna play it, you're not gonna show them. but it's kind of an intangible benefit where it's like, okay, like it matters, but it doesn't matter all that much. Like, what are they going to do? How are they going to play differently? Probably not going to play that much differently. But where it does matter, and I would suggest if you are blue, green, splash red, play out that mountain sooner rather than later. Because if that mountain is the last land stuck in your hand, then you're in a tough spot because you're like, oh, well, I don't want to discard this, and I also don't want to discard a spell. If you just played the mountain earlier, you could discard your forest and you'd be okay with that. So just something to not get gotten by. Assimilate Essence. Next one here. This is 1 in a blue. It's the counter spell, target creature or battle unless its controller pays 4. And if they do, you incubate. So this is a great card because it's great at any point in the game. So if my opponent plays a 2-drop, I'll just counter it. Like I was saying, keeping pace with the opponent. The role of this card in your deck, its function, is not always to counter bombs. It's also to answer their 2-drops. It's also great in the mid game, being able to like play something, maybe wake up an incubate token and hold this up. That's a nice thing to do. But also as the game goes on, I'm more willing to just hold it. Just hold, because there is, you know, Atali's running around and Elesh Norns, like I've been mentioning. And yeah, you do run into the issue of it does become dead at some point, and maybe they play like a good 4-cost creature and they have 8 lands in play, and you're like, that doesn't actually work. Sure, it does become like quote unquote kind of dead at some point, but the later the game goes, the more I'm actually still willing to keep this in hand. I don't feel like it's going to be super dead because, you know, you can usually deal with their 4-drops, 5-drops with attacking and blocking. You do want to worry about the things with good enter the battlefield effects that you can't just answer with a removal spell. So I'm still more likely to hold this in the late game rather than not. And like I said, don't be afraid to fire it off on turn 2. A group of cards here, the Land Cyclers. So Timberland Ancient, Tile Terror, Gloomfang Mauler, Alabaster Host Intercessor, Furnace Host Charger. These cards have been mediocre for the most part. Now, it's not like you don't play them. You definitely do sometimes. But they're not just auto-includes for sure. You want a reason to play them. I think Title Terror is the one I'm most happy about. It kind of does fall into that camp of, I mean, most of these do, of, well, it's an expensive thing that doesn't do anything, and it gets gotten by an interaction spell. I found that Title Terror is, you know, in my blue-black control decks lacking a finisher. Often that's acceptable. This is kind of the exception because you've controlled the game so much where it's like, okay, if they kill it, it's not going to be a giant tempo blowout because they kill it and maybe they don't get in with a bunch of stuff. They don't have a bunch of stuff because you've killed and countered their stuff. So yes, they can bounce your Title Terror. They can remove it. No harm, no foul though, because it's not like they then attack you for a bunch. So this is the one I'm kind of most interested in putting in my deck. Alabaster Host Intercessor. This is one that people, you know, definitely hyped up a lot. I hyped it up before the set came out. It looks like a really good card. The 5 mana, this is the white one that exiles something that when it comes in. It's got a lot of problems that aren't obvious on first read. One, of course, you know, just the thing I was talking about. If you play this, you don't really want to target any of your opponent's HEB effect creatures, a Halo Forger or something, because they go, all right, just remove it, I get my trigger again. That's pretty bad. It's really good at killing the incubate tokens. That's kind of nice, and that's what I'm looking mostly to do with this card. But you know, it's not a card I'm just like dying to play. I think it's a very overrated card considering where people take it. And looking on 17 lands, people take this on average like 4th pick or something, quite highly. The other ones I'm willing to put in my deck. Maybe I'm lacking some top end. I think Timberland Ancient is the one that I'm going to put in my deck, mostly if I have Emoti. That's a blue-green uncommon, 5 mana, 3 blue-green for a 3/1 Cascade. And whenever you cost a 6-cost or greater spell, you Cascade. Like, that's a pretty good 6-cost card to Cascade with. You know, I mentioned before last week with Emoti, you don't need to build around Emoti. Emoti is just good on its own as a 5 mana, 3/1 Cascade. But, you know, Timberland Ancient, maybe I'll throw one in as my 23rd playable. If you're using these as fixing, I've got the question, okay, do you want to cut lands if you have these? I think if you're playing 2 of them, you can cut your first land, but I also would hope not to play 2 of them. You know, like, and another thing is kind of tying into land counts in this format. Most of my decks are 17 lands. I think you don't want to go to 16 lands almost ever. Like, even in your more aggressive decks, you do have a lot to do with your mana. It's kind of funny, paradoxically, the green decks, like the green ramping decks, those are the decks I'm more likely to play fewer lands, because I have mana sources in my spell count, right? I have stuff like Portent Tracker, which is the 2 mana 1/1 untap a land, or the Burgeoning Land, right? The green enchantment that makes your lands tap for any color, and you incubate 2. So I'm actually more willing to go down a land in those kind of decks if I've got these cyclers or I've got mana sources. But in my like blue-black control decks, I very, very rarely go to 16 lands, or like even my more aggressive decks. Like I think you really do have so many ways to spend your mana, and getting stuck on 3, like I was talking about keeping pace, getting stuck on 3 lands is a great way to not keep pace. Like that's a great way to just lose the game very quickly if your opponent's playing stuff and you're not. So just a note on land counts there. Next up, I've talked about it at length both this week and last, but Breeding Champion. 2 and a blue for a 2/2 flyer. When it enters the battlefield, create a 1/1 blue and red elemental creature token. All I want to say about this card is don't be afraid to block with it. I've seen people kind of like resistant to blocking with it. And, you know, if you've got a battle lined up, you know, definitely reasonable. But this ties back again with the keeping pace with your opponent. Your opponent's attacking with a 3/3 incubate token. Do you have an answer for that? Well, are you going to answer it next turn? I just double block. Like, double block with your Breeding Champion. Part of the reason this card is so good is because it stabilizes you extremely well. You know, you kind of think, oh, I don't want to block my flyer. But if your hand has got other good stuff in it, you just don't want to fall behind. So just a word to the wise, just don't worry about, you know, blocking with this. It's a good card because you have that option a lot of the time. Next up, I just want a quick note about backup creatures. You know, they do have a lot of different abilities, so it's hard to talk about them as a whole. But one general statement I can say about where to put the backup counter, or when do you back up on something else, when do you back up on the creature itself that has the backup ability. Often I will back up onto the creature itself that has the backup ability if my creatures on board already have a good attack. If they don't, well, that's the benefit of the backup creatures. They enable attack. But if you're kind of like, I'm not sure which one I should do here. Like, do I want to have kind of haste damage here? I'm like, okay, I get 1 more point of damage here, but my Bola Slinger, for example, is now a 2/2. Generally not worth it. I think if you have a good attack, you just should back up your own thing because, you know, a 2/2 Bola Slinger, to use an example, is way worse than a 3/3 Bola Slinger. Like, that thing just gets blocked. Bola Slinger as a 3/3 has the chance to then, you know, next turn be able to get in multiple times. So just, it's not going to pan out all the time like this, and because they are so different, they have different abilities, it's not a clear-cut example, but I would just say more times than not, I would follow that rule. Next up here, we got Eyes of Gitaxias. This is 2 and a blue for a sorcery. Incubate 3, and you draw a card. Another one of the more underrated cards in the format right now. I'm wheeling these cards a lot of the time, and they're just great. They're just one of the best commons in the set. And I think partially why it's underrated is it looks a bit clunky. You're like, oh, draw a card, incubate 3. But just some thoughts on how to play this card. So if you're not under pressure, I'm okay firing this on turn 3. But I just play it on turn 3. And when I say not under pressure, I mean maybe the opponents play like a 1/3 on turn 2, right? If they have a 2/2, you probably want to, once again, I'm going to say it, keep pace with them. But if they play something that's not that threatening, or maybe they just didn't play a 2-drop, I'm perfectly happily firing it off on turn 2 if I don't have a better play. And even if you are under a little bit of pressure and this is your only thing to do on turn 3, you don't feel too bad about it. And this is what makes this card pretty good, is that after you cast this card on turn 3, your turn 4 looks pretty good, right? Because you can have this 3/3 blocker that blanks most of the early creatures, or at least trades with them, and then have 2 mana to spend on something else. I think most of the time, I'm casting this in the late game. Casting it on turn 5 is just like a 5 mana 3/3 draw card. That's just still great. But the beauty of this card, and a lot of the cards I've been talking about today, is they are so modular. And you don't mind at any point of the game doing the different things. So don't be worried about putting this card in your deck thinking it's a bit too slow. And also, don't be too concerned about firing it off on turn 3, because you do get that tempo back in a lot of ways on turn 4. Last card is Omen Hawker, and this is not so much a gameplay thing, it's just a deck building thing, but I do want to talk about this card. Single blue mana for a 1/1. It's got the ability tap, add a colorless and a blue. Spend this mana only to activate abilities. You like Soul Ring? Because this is kind of Soul Ring in a lot of spots. I mean, you know, it's a bit of hyperbole. You can't cast a 5-drop off of this on turn 3. But if your deck has, I would say, 7 ways to use this, it's going to be quite a good card. And the ways to use it, of course, are the Flip Phyrexians, incubate tokens, the curve of going Omen Hawker into something on turn 2, into Eyes of Gitaxias, flip the eyes right away. That's a really, really great curve. So it doesn't take that much for this card to pull its weight, basically. That 7 number is what I would aim for. If I'm a little below 7, say I have 6 or 5, I could still consider putting this card in my deck if I also have Convoke spells. Because, you know, any 1 mana 1/1 is going to tap for mana. The Omen Hawker isn't anything special when you have Convoke cards. But that does mean some of the time you don't draw the activated abilities. The Omen Hawker acts kind of like a Llanowar or Elf for those Convoke cards. So that does push me to like, well, I've got 6 or 5, but I've got 3 Convoke cards. Okay, I'm going to put this card in my deck. I would describe this as a narrow but powerful card. It doesn't go in any for every blue deck, but if you can look for those opportunities where, you know, you get a little bit late, people don't like this card that much, you get like 6th, 7th pick a lot of the time, pick it up, and especially if you're, you know, there's nothing else in the pack, speculate on it, because you might end up in a spot with just a lot of Incubate or a lot of the Flip Phyrexians. Alright, and that's going to do it for today. Thank you so much for listening and watching. And by the way, let me know if you like this gameplay episode at this point in the format. I might do it in different formats at this point, because gameplay does get underrepresented in content because it's easier to talk about drafts. Let me know if this is helpful. And I will say too, if you're struggling in this format and you feel like your decks are good, really take a look at your gameplay, because that is going to be something. I would bet there is something there. It's hard to notice it yourself, but sometimes you can just go back if you have 17 lands and look, and you're like, well, that was stupid. Why did I do that? If you also want, put it in a Discord, either mine, there's Lords of the Limited Discord if you're in that. A lot of people that are going to be willing to help. If there's anything that Magic players like, it's showing how smart they are and showing that their technical prowess is better than yours, and people are very willing to jump on that. So check that out. Once again, thank you so much for listening and watching, and we'll see you next time.